In the autumn of 1879, on the banks of the Loup River in Nebraska Territory, the people of Cutter's Bend watched a man do something that made no sense. He was not building a cabin. He was not raising a barn. He was digging a hole into the frozen face of the riverbank, 6 feet deep, with his bare hands turning blue around the handle of a shovel. Winter in that country did not ask twice before it killed. Men froze standing up, still holding the rope to their own barn door. And here was Emmett Voss, cast out with no warning 2 weeks before the first hard frost, choosing by his own hand to live inside the earth like something buried. Everyone thought they knew how this would end. They were wrong. Before the story is over, you will meet a dog that stopped sleeping where he was told to sleep, a thermometer that ended an argument without a single word, and a storm so cold the old-timers still measure other winters against it. So stay to the end, because the man they laughed at is about to become the reason half that valley survived, and if you want to see exactly how, subscribe now, because what happened next is the kind of thing this channel was built to tell. They called it the Mud Rat's Den before the first shovelful of dirt had even cooled. Silas Pratt, who ran the feed store and had an opinion about everything a man did with his own 2 hands, was the one who coined it. He stood at the top of the bank with his thumbs hooked in his belt and watched Emmett work below him in the cold October light. "Look at him," Silas said to whoever would listen, digging himself a grave and calling it a house. The name stuck the way names do in small places, fast and forever. Voss's Hole, some called it. Others just said the Mud Rat's Den and left it at that. Emmett heard every word. He was 2 weeks off his father-in-law's land by then, put off it without so much as a night's notice, told plainly that a man who had buried his wife had no more claim to the roof her father owned. He had a wagon, a dog, $40, and a stretch of riverbank nobody wanted because it flooded every spring and froze solid every winter. He said nothing back to Silas Pratt. He kept digging. Silence in that country was not weakness, it was armor. The women of the town were kinder in their words, but not in their thinking. They shook their heads at the widow's church socials and called it a tragedy. On top of a tragedy, a grieving man losing his mind along with his wife. Children ran along the top of the bank and threw pebbles down at him. Not out of cruelty exactly, but because that is what children do with a strange thing they don't understand. Emmett Voss let the pebbles fall. He had a dog with him, a lean brown mutt with one ear that never stood upright, and he had named him Rook, after a bird that could find shelter in a bare tree when nothing else could. Rook did not care what the town called the hole in the bank. Rook only cared that his master kept digging, and so the dog kept digging alongside him, in his own clumsy way, kicking dirt between his back legs as if he understood something the town did not. There were 2 other mockers worth naming, because a humiliation this size is never carried by one man alone. There was Hiram Duell, who ran the livery and liked to say a man ought to build up toward heaven, not down toward the other place. And there was young Ollie Cade, barely 20, who took to calling out evening, Mole, whenever Emmett passed through town for supplies. Emmett bought his nails and his salt pork without answering either of them. He had buried a wife 3 months before. A nickname, next to that, weighed nothing at all. What the town did not know, what nobody in Cutter's Bend had ever bothered to ask him, was that Emmett Voss had learned this from a man most of them had never met. 6 years before, as a young freight hand hauling goods along the Missouri, Emmett had wintered over with an old river trader named Jedediah Cole, a man so weathered by cold rivers that his hands looked more like driftwood than flesh. Cole did not live in a cabin. He lived in a dugout carved into the bluff above the river, and Emmett remembered walking into it out of a hard sleet one November evening, expecting a hole full of mud, and coming out into something that felt, impossibly, like a held breath of summer. The old man had laughed at his surprise. "Boy," he said, working a plug of tobacco in his cheek, "everybody looks at a riverbank and sees dirt. I look at it and see a wall 4,000 years thick that ain't never once caught fire, never once blown down, and never once asked me for a nail." He told Emmett that a river spends 100 years teaching the land around it where the cold can reach and where it cannot. The bank remembers the frost only bites the first few feet. Past that, the earth holds its own steady warmth all winter, same as a cellar keeps potatoes from freezing, while snow piles 3 feet deep on the door above it. Cole had a saying he repeated so often that Emmett could still hear it in the old man's cracked voice all these years later. The river never lies about where the warmth hides. Emmett had filed it away the way a young man files away most old men's wisdom, respectfully and without much use for it. He had gone on to marry Clara, to build a life he thought would need no dugouts and no old river sayings at all. But Clara had died of a fever the winter before, in a cabin with walls so thin the frost grew on the inside of the window pane by her bed, and Emmett had spent every night since asking himself if a warmer wall might have kept her breathing until spring. When her father put him off the land, cold and grieving and out of options, it was not desperation that sent him to the riverbank. It was memory. It was Jedediah Cole's voice, and a debt Emmett meant to finally collect. There was one more thing he remembered from that winter. A smaller moment he had not thought of in years until he stood at the top of the riverbank with a shovel in his hand. He had once asked the old man, half in jest, why he didn't just build a proper house like everyone else along the river. Cole had looked at him with something between pity and amusement and said, "Proper is just a word people use for what they're already used to seeing. This bank has kept me warmer for less wood than any proper house I ever stood inside. A dead wall rots. Boy, a breathing wall survives." Emmett had not understood the difference between a dead wall and a breathing one back then. Standing there in October, with frost already whitening the grass at his feet, he meant to understand it now, before the snow came for good. Not every man in Cutter's Bend was content to mock from a distance. Otis Krieg was the best builder in 3 counties, a broad, careful Dutchman who had raised half the barns and church steeples in the valley. And when he came down to the riverbank to see the dugout for himself, he did not come to laugh. He came because he respected the danger of what Emmett was attempting, and he wanted to talk him out of it before the ground killed him. "I'll say what needs saying," Otis told him, standing at the mouth of the excavation with his arms folded. "Come spring thaw, that river rises 8-10 feet some years. You dig your home into ground that floods, you'll wake up swimming, if you wake up at all." Emmett listened. Otis went on. "And even if the water don't take you, the damp will. Earth walls sweat. You'll get mold in your bedding, rot in your timbers, mice in your walls by the 100, looking for the one warm hole in a frozen county. I've torn out 3 soddies, gone to black rot inside 2 winters. This ground don't forgive laziness, and it don't forgive ignorance either." These were not the words of a fool, and Emmett never once treated them as such. He knew Otis Krieg had seen more failed shelters than any man in the territory, and that every objection he raised was a real one. paid for by other men's ruined winters. "You're not wrong about any of it," Emmett finally said. "I mean to build above the floodline, not into it. I mean to line the walls so the damp has somewhere to go besides my blankets. And the mice?" He allowed himself the ghost of a smile. "The first anyone had seen on him since the funeral. The mice will just have to fight my dog for it." Otis did not laugh, and he did not stay to help. But he did not walk away shaking his head either. He walked away thoughtful. And thoughtful, for a man like Otis Krieg, was the closest thing to hope Emmett could ask for. By the last week of August, before the first frost had even touched the valley, Emmett had already chosen his ground and cut the first stake into it, because he knew from Jedediah Cole that a dugout built in haste was a dugout built to fail. By mid-September, he had cleared brush and marked his lines with cord and stakes. 18 feet back into the bank, 6 feet down, the whole outline scratched into the clay like a promise he meant to keep. Through the last weeks of October and into a bitter November, Emmett Voss built. He chose his ground first, a good 12 feet above the river's high water mark, where an old cut bank curved into a natural shoulder of clay and root-bound earth. He drove a stake there and did not move it again. The digging itself was brutal, joyless work. Pick and shovel through soil already stiffening with the season's first hard frosts. 6 feet down and 18 feet back into the bank, wide enough for 2 rooms and a passage between them. His palms split and bled inside his gloves within the first 3 days. He wrapped them in strips of an old shirt each night and dug again each morning. He shored the tunnel roof with hand-hewn oak posts set every 3 feet, each one notched and fitted so tight a knife blade couldn't slide the joint. Because Otis Krieg's warning about collapse rang in his ears with every foot he cleared. The walls themselves, he built thick 36 inches of packed clay and sod, damped in layers no more than 4 inches at a time, so the earth would compress into something closer to stone than dirt. He learned, the way Cole had once told him, a man learns anything worth knowing by doing it wrong first and paying attention to why. He drove a chimney flue up through 11 feet of bank at a careful angle so smoke would draw without letting rain pour back down it. And he lined the firebox with riverstone he hauled up from the shallows 1 armload at a time, 40, 50 pounds at a trip, until his shoulders burned worse than his hands. For the roof over the entrance room, he laid split logs across close-set beams, then packed 18 inches of sod on top, root side down, so the grass itself would knit into a living seal. By spring, he built a door frame of salvaged plank, hung a door 2 inches thick, and packed the gap around it with dried river grass and clay so tight that not even a candle flame guttered when he tested it, holding a stub of tallow candle an inch from the seam and watching the flame stand as straight and still as a soldier. By the last week of November, he had spent nearly 2 cords of split oak just keeping himself fed and warm through the digging alone. And he had $11 left of his original $40, spent mostly on nails, hinges, and a single pane of window glass no bigger than a Bible, set high in the entrance wall to let in what little daylight a Nebraska winter allowed. That stillness, more than anything, was the thing he was building toward. He remembered Cole's second lesson now, the one that mattered as much as the first. It was never really the cold that killed a man in a cabin. It was the moving air finding every crack and stealing the warmth out through it, degree by degree. All night long, stop the air from moving, and you had already won most of the fight. He carved a narrow vent shaft up through the bank above the fire, angled and capped with a hinged flap of hide. so the dugout could breathe just enough to keep the fire fed without ever letting the wind find a straight path in. By the second week of November, walking into Emmett Voss's dugout out of a hard sleet felt exactly the way it had felt walking into Jedediah Cole's 6 years and a lifetime ago, like stepping through a door into a hell breath of summer. The first real failure came on a night in late November, and it nearly ended everything. Emmett had banked the fire high before sleeping, confident in his work, and woke near midnight coughing, the passage thick with smoke that had no business filling the room instead of climbing the flue. He crawled out into the entrance chamber gasping, dragging Rook by the scruff, and by the light of a lantern he found the trouble fast. A hard freeze that week had crept further into the bank than he'd reckoned, and a seam of ice had formed inside the flue itself, high up where the stone lining gave way to raw earth, narrowing the draw until the smoke had nowhere to go but back down into the room. He sat in the cold entrance chamber with the dog pressed against his side, furious with himself, and made himself study the failure instead of cursing it. The flue was sound in its stonework. The trouble was that raw earth, unlike stone, held moisture that froze and swelled and choked the passage the colder the season got. He tore the upper section of the flue apart the next morning, with his hands still raw from digging, and rebuilt it with a full stone lining all the way to the surface this time, packing the gap behind the stones with dry sand instead of clay, so there was nothing left in that channel for the frost to grab hold of. It cost him 2 days of hauling stone in weather that had already turned mean, and it cost him some pride. Standing there, rebuilding a job the whole town already believed was foolish. But when he lit the fire again that second night, the smoke rose clean and straight and did not come back down, and Emmett understood something Otis Craig had tried to warn him of without either of them quite naming it. A shelter that could not bend when it was wrong would eventually break where it mattered most. This one had bent. It held. By early December, something in the valley had changed, and it had nothing to do with men at all. The geese that usually lingered on the river until the ice forced them south left nearly 3 weeks early that year, lifting off in one great restless column on a morning that felt no colder than any other. The old-timers noticed. Jedediah Cole would have noticed too, though he was 3 winters in his grave by then, and Emmett only had his memory to go by. Rook stopped sleeping in his usual spot just inside the dugout door, and began instead to lie pressed flat against the base of the vent shaft outside, ears up, nose working, refusing to be coaxed back in no matter how Emmett called him. A dog does not flatter a wall, and a dog does not lie awake at a vent shaft for no reason at all. Then, on the 9th of December, the wind simply stopped. Not softened, stopped. The way a held breath stops, the way the whole valley seemed to be waiting on something it could not name. No birds called. No branches moved. Smoke from the town's chimneys rose in unnaturally straight lines, needle-thin, into a sky gone the color of old pewter. An old trapper named Amos Steele, who had outlived 2 wives and 3 winters that other men still spoke of in hushed voices, stood outside the general store that afternoon and said to no one in particular, "I don't like this quiet." I've heard it before. Nobody in Cutter's Bend slept easy that night, though most of them could not have said exactly why. Emmett banked his fire heavier than usual and checked the vent flap twice before he lay down, and even then he found himself lying awake, listening to a silence so complete it felt like something leaning its weight against the door. Rook would not settle beside him. The dog paced the length of the entrance room 3 times, then lay down hard against the vent shaft wall with a groan, and did not move again until morning. Not warm, never warm, Still, that was the whole of that night. Still air and stopped birds and a dog that would not be comforted. The storm came down out of the north 2 days later like something with a grievance to settle, and the people of Cutter's Bend would call it the Bone Winter for the rest of their lives. It arrived without warning shots, no gathering clouds, no gentle build. 1 hour the pewter sky held its silence. The next, a wall of white came screaming down the valley and swallowed the horizon whole. The temperature, which had sat at a merely miserable 8 degrees that morning, fell to 38 below zero by the following dawn, and the wind behind it drove that cold through every seam and shingle crack in every cabin in the county. Nature had arrived, and nature never negotiated its verdicts. It did not care that Silas Pratt had a family, or that Otis Creek had built half the buildings now groaning under the weight of drifted snow. The storm judged everything the same way, by results. Cabins with thin walls and honest craftsmanship both froze the water in their basins the same. Livestock that had no shelter died standing in the fields, and livestock that had shelter but poor shelter died lying down in it, which was somehow worse to find. For 3 days, the bone winter erased the valley. No travel, no light past a man's own doorstep. Nothing but the shriek of wind and the low groan of buildings built for ordinary winters. Not this one. Hiram Doole lost 2 horses in his own livery that first night. Animals that froze standing in stalls he had always considered sound enough. Silas Pratt's feed store roof buckled under drift by the second morning, and the man who had once stood laughing at the top of the riverbank spent that day instead shoveling snow off his own collapsing storefront, saying nothing to anyone. The cold hunts walls, and on the Bone Winter's second day, it found every weak one in the valley, and did not knock politely before it came in. On the second night of the storm, Emmett Voss nearly lost everything he had built. He woke to a smell he recognized instantly and feared more than smoke. The flat, mineral smell of a fire starving for air. The vent shaft, the one piece of his shelter that had to keep working no matter what, had iced over solid at its outer flap, sealed shut by driven snow, and his own breath's moisture freezing again and again against the hide covering until it had become a plug of ice as hard as the stone around it. Without that vent, the fire would smother, and without the fire, 36 inches of earth wall would do him no good at all. It would simply hold the cold in as faithfully as it had once held the warmth. He had no choice but to go out into it. He wrapped his face in wool until only a slit remained for his eyes, tied a length of rope from his belt to the door frame so the wind could not carry him off into the white the way it had carried off men before him, and crawled up the face of the bank on his hands and knees with a fire iron gripped so hard his fingers ached through 2 pairs of gloves. He could not see the vent until his hand found it by feel. He struck at the ice with the iron. Once, twice, the wind screaming loud enough to steal the sound of his own shouting. And, on the 3rd strike, the plug gave way, and a plume of hot, smoke-stinking air rushed up past his face like something alive and grateful to be free. He lay there a moment longer than he should have, half frozen, half laughing with relief, before the rope reminded him of the way home, and he crawled back down it, hand over hand, into the warm dark of the dugout, where Rook was waiting, whining, at the door. He did not sleep again that night. He sat by the fire, with his hands wrapped around a tin cup of hot water, and he thought, more than once, of Clara, and of the thin walls that had not saved her. and he understood that what he had just fought for on that icy bank was not merely his own life. It was an old debt, finally being paid. Heat survives where air dies, Cole used to say, and Emmett understood now that the reverse was just as true. A man could die where air moved freely, even inside 4 feet of good earth, if he let the one narrow channel that fed his fire choke shut and did nothing about it. He had not let it. That, in the end, was the whole of the difference between a shelter that held and one that didn't. The storm broke on the morning of the 4th day, and what it left behind told its own story without a single word of argument. Otis Creek was among the first to make it down to the riverbank once the drifts allowed passage, driven less by curiosity than by a grim certainty that he would find the mudrat's den collapsed and its owner frozen inside it. What he found instead was smoke rising steady and thin from a chimney that had never once stopped drawing, and Emmett Voss standing at his door in his shirt sleeves. Otis did not believe it until he saw the numbers for himself. Emmett had kept 2 thermometers through the whole ordeal, one nailed outside the door, one hung inside near the hearth, and a ledger where he had written the readings twice a day, out of the same stubborn habit that had made him rebuild the flue instead of giving up on it. He showed Otis the ledger without a word of pride in his voice. On the worst morning of the bone winter, the outside thermometer had read 38 below zero. The one inside the dugout that same morning, before he had even fed the fire, read 34 above. 69 degrees of difference, sitting quiet in a column of ink, needing no interpretation at all. Otis Creek pressed his bare palm flat against the warm stone of the hearth wall, the same wall he had once warned would rot and cave and drown its owner, and held it there a long moment. "I was wrong," he said. "Just that. Nothing more." In a country where dialogue ran sparse and plain, 3 words carried the weight of a full apology, and Emmett accepted it the same way he had accepted everything else that winter, with a nod and silence, and no satisfaction shown on his face at all. The ledger showed one more number that mattered more to Otis than any thermometer reading. Through 3 full days of the bone winter, Emmett had burned less than a quarter cord of wood, keeping the dugout warm enough to work in shirt sleeves, while Otis's own well-built cabin, by his own admission, had gone through nearly a full cord in half that time, just to keep its water from freezing solid. A wall that breathes, it turned out, asked for far less than a wall that merely stood tall. The knock came 4 nights later, well after dark, while Emmett sat mending a harness by the fire. He opened the door to find Silas Pratt standing in the snow with his wife and 2 children behind him. Their own cabin's roof caved in under the storm's weight, their stove cold, their faces grey with a cold that had nothing left to give. Silas could not meet Emmett's eyes at first. The man who had coined the mudrat's den, who had stood at the top of the bank and laughed while a grieving man dug his own shelter, now stood at the bottom of it, asking, in a voice stripped of every ounce of the pride it once carried, whether there might be room. Emmett did not make him ask twice, and he did not make him say more than that. He stepped back from the door and said only, "Coming out of the cold," and helped carry the youngest child inside himself. There was no speech given that night, no accounting of old insults settled, no moment where Emmett Voss reminded Silas Pratt of a single word he'd once said. The warmth of the room did all the talking that needed doing. Rook, for his part, simply moved over by the hearth to make space for the children, as if he had been waiting all along for someone besides his master to finally understand what the fuss had been about. The Pratt's eldest girl, no more than 7, sat wrapped in a blanket by the fire and looked up at the earth walls around her with wide, wondering eyes. "Is the dirt really what keeps it warm?" she asked. Emmett thought about it a moment before he answered her, the way he thought about most things now. "The dirt just keeps still," he told her. "Cold can't get through a thing that's holding still. Same as fear can't get a good grip on a man who won't run from it." She did not fully understand him, but she nodded anyway, the way children do, and fell asleep not long after, warm for the first time in 3 days. By the following autumn, half the families along that stretch of the Loop River had dug their own shelters into the bank, following measurements Emmett had drawn out on scraps of brown paper for anyone who asked, refusing every offer of payment beyond a shared meal and a place at the table. Otis Creek himself helped raise 3 of them, correcting a young farmer's flu work with the same care he'd once used to warn Emmett away from the whole idea. Nobody called it the Mudrat's Den anymore. Somewhere in that second winter, without anyone quite deciding it on purpose, the valley began calling it the Voss Bank instead, and the name traveled further than Cutter's Bend ever did, carried east by freight drivers, spoken of in other river towns the way a useful thing gets spoken of, passed hand to hand like a good tool. Silas Pratt himself dug the 4th one that spring, working alongside Emmett with his own 2 hands, and never once mentioned the name he had coined 2 winters before. Nobody remembered the laughter anymore. They only remembered the thing that worked. Emmett Voss never spoke much about that winter, not even in the years after, when men would ask him outright how he'd known. When he did answer, he gave them the same 6 words Jedediah Cole had once given him, the ones that had carried him through every doubting voice and every foot of frozen earth. The river never lies about where the warmth hides. The strongest shelter, it turned out, was never the one that looked strongest standing above the ground in plain view of a mocking town. It was the one that understood what the land had already been quietly protecting for 100 years before anyone thought to ask it. So here is the question this story leaves you with, and there is no gentle way around it. If you had stood at the top of that riverbank in the autumn of 1879, watching a grieving, cast-out man dig a hole into frozen earth while the whole town laughed, would you have laughed along with them? Or would you have been one of the few willing to listen to what winter had been trying to teach all along?